This is the Library Channel from Arizona State University.
Well, I know some of you, many of you I don't know. My name is Sander van der Leeuw, and Chuck has asked me to introduce myself so that you know that I am the director of one of the sponsoring groups of Elinor Ostrom's lecture today. I direct the School of Human Evolution and Social Change, and we are sponsoring this very special event for all of us, together with the CAP LTER and with the Wrigley Lecture Series of the Global Institute of Sustainability. Why is this such a special occasion? Well, I think in many ways it is a special occasion both for Elinor Ostrom, who will be speaking to you, and for us to have the privilege of having her here. She is a political scientist, although when I first met her, I would never have guessed that. I probably met her much more as an environmental scientist than as a political scientist, and I think what you just said sort of reinforces that feeling. She is currently the A.F. Bentley Professor of Political Science at Indiana University in Bloomington. She has one of those CVs, which I try to go through, that you come very quickly to the point of asking, how is it possible to cram all of that in a life? She is a member of the National Academy of Sciences, of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the American Philosophical Society, and I could go on like that for at least 10 minutes. What is striking about her CV and her career is that she has honors in so many different fields, and I'll get back to that in a moment. But there are awards in political science, in environmental science, in social science in a more general sense. She was also very heavily involved in the American Society of Political Science, or the American Political Science Association, as a president, as a vice president, as a whole page full of committees and things like that. I don't want to go into those honors. You can all get those eventually. I would like to say a little bit more personal about her being here and how I got to know Elinor. What I realized actually today as I was doing this is that we first met at ASU in 2000 on the occasion, I think, of the creation of the biocomplexity program. Was that right? Okay, I didn't quite have the occasion right anymore, but I wasn't sure at least about that. And since then, over the last 7 years, we have run into each other on a number of different occasions which actually illustrate the same diversity in what Elinor has been doing. We met many times in the context of the International Human Dimensions of Global Change program, but also in the Resilience Alliance, in the Santa Fe Institute, and many places like that. And I think a lot of that is because she does a very original way of doing science. It is interdisciplinary science, and the title of today's talk, Linking Forests, Trees and People from the Air, on the Ground and in the Lab, gives you a little bit of the scope of what all of that means. But there is much more to it than that. She is one of these people who manages to do her science by using all kinds of different approaches, irrespective of discipline, simply focusing on a set of issues and questions. And in preparing for this, I was struck maybe most by this wonderful piece of research that you both did, Vincent and Elinor, in a long time ago, I think, but it also lasted a long time, to try and convince police departments that they go about everything they do just about the wrong way. And the issue there was, should they be more centralized or should they be less centralized? Should you make big departments with central facilities, or should you actually use the knowledge on the ground, the spatially dispersed knowledge, as a very important part of what you're trying to do is fighting crime. And I don't know much about the research, but one of the conclusions that really struck home is that you need to use on-the-ground knowledge much more than sort of academically derived knowledge. And now I'm shifting fields from the police to my own experience as an anthropologist, where of course we always have this debate: what is more important, what is more legitimate? People who are living a life and gathering information that way on the ground as farmers or as foresters or anything else, or the academics who interfere in their life, come up with all sorts of fanciful ideas but miss that on-the-ground information. I think one of the main achievements of your career is to show a lot of people how important the interaction between those kinds of knowledge actually is, and how important it is to draw independent conclusions from that and simply then follow your own way. And that is maybe also a little bit of the answer to the CV. I think the thing that has struck me most is that above all, you have remained yourself in all of this. As a person, as a wonderful, warm person, as a very interesting role model, but at the same time very modest, very personable, and very accessible. And with that, I'm coming to the reason for this particular talk and for this particular presence of Elinor here on campus, and why we are so very happy to have her here, because she accepted to actually be part of our faculty on a part-time basis for the years to come. That in itself, I think, says something about both her way of doing science and what this campus and this university is about at this particular time. Because her institutional research, which has to do with how the management of resources in different cultures create different ways of making institutions and running them, and some of the advantages and disadvantages of these different ways, is, I think, a very important, and to this date was a missing element in a lot of what we are doing in GEOS, in the Sustainability Initiative, and in our own school. And so we were very pleased when we asked her to be the founding director of the Center for the Study of Institutional Diversity, which herewith I announce publicly, even though we don't have the required stamps and things like that. But everybody is agreed that we are creating that, and it actually has a spatial identity in what is called Matthews Hall. And that identity, I think some of you have also been seeing in a much more personal way in the form of Marty Andries and Marco Janssen, who are both the first people in that center with Elinor. And so we are extremely pleased that that has come off the ground, that we can work in this very important interface, and that at the same time we can have somebody among our faculty who is such a wonderful role model for interdisciplinary science. And with that, I'd like to leave it to you, Elinor, and to tell us more about how you link forests, trees, and people in every which way possible.
Thank you, Sander, very, very much. As you can see, I'm already a year out of date. I had forgotten that we'd gotten to 2007, and there we are with showing my being. I'm very honored to be here. This is an exciting place. You're doing important work. And it is an honor for Vincent and I to join you in this endeavor. And the paper that I'm drawing on for the lecture is written with Harini Nagendra. It is just out in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. I would have loved it if Harini could join me for part of it, but she has a bug in the throat. But I think there's some questions later that if we get into some aspects of remote sensing, while it's a method that I use with my colleague, the expert is sitting right here. So, we have thanks to many people in terms of our colleagues in Nepal, in India. There's an International Forestry Resources and Institutions program that you will all hear about. We've had colleagues who've helped collect and analyze the data, and we've had many funders, and we're very appreciative of them. Now, many of you know the policy debate, but since 1968, many of us have had our lives changed because of the very graphic article written by Garrett Hardin on the tragedy of the Commons, and we've had huge debates since that time about what is the optimal thing to do. We've had strong claims that government ownership's the only way, private ownership's the only way, community ownership's the only way. There are now many government-owned parks. Some people call them paper parks. Some of the paper parks are real. And there are many, many decentralization policies. But the real problem, the challenge, is to obtain reliable and useful data about the impact of formal property. What does it mean when you change the formal? You've got a new piece of paper. But how do we get data? How do we understand what's happening when you change the paper? And so a lot of the empirical analysis is talking about 150 countries and all the forests in the world, but that doesn't help us get down on the ground. There are going to be factors at very large scales, at medium scales, and very small scales that affect. So we have to get in and unravel the incentives of actors at multiple scales, and it's hard to know which policies actually work. So what I want to do today is we're going to take a journey, and we're going to use 3 different empirical methods to better assess and try to begin an assessment of how formal tenure affects control of overharvesting in forest resources. So let's then look at the advantage of multiple methods. The 3 we're looking at today, and these are not the only 3 that we would use over time, but right now we'll be looking at remotely sensed images, which provide reliable measures of land use change within different management regimes. Advantage, 30 years or so. You're not interviewing somebody and they're trying to figure out how to tell you something you want to hear, because you're measuring it in a way that's unobtrusive, and it allows you to go back in time. On the other hand, on-the-ground studies give you a chance to see and talk and measure things with the people on the ground. And then we do experimental studies at Indiana, and I'm very glad to see that you're starting to do them here. And we'll be doing some where we do them both here and at Indiana, and we'll talk about that toward the end. So let's look at from the air first. And remote sensing is the most frequently used method from the air, and in conjunction with geographic information systems and knowing, then you've got to get the institutional boundaries, you've got to get the underlying structure, you've got to get a lot to put it together, but once you put it together, you can go back in time. And we are going to be looking at a particular part of the world in this presentation where it is very dense populations, where they have very high dependence, and in India, supposed to be very strong protection, and in Nepal, supposed to be decentralization. Now, for those of you who want just a little bit of a sense, in Nepal is up there, right in here, and then the part of India that we're looking at is there in the center. And we're going to be using multi-temporal and underline that temporal, color composites. These provide a synoptic view of landscape from 3 dates and times. So you start off with a very rigorous ecological model and a geologic, I can't even think of the name of the underlying structure. You'll get it later for me. That where you get the underlying structure and the everything to scale. Then you need to be putting the land use on top of that, and you then take information from the green bands of each image, and you can then show the change over time, and you can then complement it by detailed classifications. So one of the ways of interpreting it, if you've not used this before, in terms of stable black, this area right in here would be an area where you've had stable forest. Stable white, areas like this, that's probably a stream. So there's been no change over time, so you get the 2 stable areas. Red and yellow changes, deforestation, deforestation, deforestation. Green and blue, regrowth. And so some places in here you have some regrowth and some places in there. That's the way you interpret it. That's the quick answer. So the focus today will be on 2 national parks in India and 1 reserve forest in India and community forests, buffer zone forests, etc. in Nepal. And we're going to evaluate changes from the mid-70s to recent dates and ask, are government forests always more effective, and do community forests always work, and those sorts of questions. So let's go first to a multi-temporal Landsat color composite. It's hard to say. 1972 was the first Landsat, then 1989, and then 2001. And it is the landscape surrounding the Tadoba Anhari Tiger Reserve. So that's going to be TATR, Tatar. As you can see, the boundaries go way up. And up here you have clearing. Inside, goodness. Inside here you have regrowth. Here you have stable forest. Oh, look, all that clearing over there. Wow, regrowth. So you're seeing stable, regrowth, clearing, all in one place, all within one tiger reserve. So we're finding multiple patterns, stable forests in the core, park guards. We're going to show you a little bit of the challenge that the park guards face. They have, as you could see around the edges, you were getting in deforestation. And Harini and colleagues have done complementary on-the-ground studies where they have found consistent harvesting of non-timber forest products and the existence of quite a bit of conflict. This is heavily guarded in some ways, and not others, and a lot of conflict. So if you look at it, here is a border. This is a forest guard standing there, kind of helpless, with one of our research colleagues, watching women harvesting thatch. I mean, it just comes in, and people come in and harvest, and out they go. And you can see some of the this is illegal harvesting, so that is not unusual that you would see it. Then, in terms of that's taking out, well, the other thing, this is the marker. The park boundary is here. There are to be no cattle grazing in this park. And, he's kind of casually going in on his daily grazing. Daily grazing. So you get a sense that part of what we could see from the remote now we know is the cows and the women taking the thatch as well as some of the other things out. So now let's take a look at 2 more protected areas in India. We're going to look at MWS, a national park with a substantial budget. They've got real money on the north in the next map. and BRF, which has not much money, much more like a normal park on the south, and we'll see much more clearing on the south. And so up here is a park that is very well endowed with money to hire guards. And you do see regrowth coming in this area in terms of that behind right there. Down here, you have much less money, and at the borders, you're getting quite a bit of clearing. The way that they keep some of the wildlife in is to have an electrified fence that keeps the wildlife in and people out where you have it. But you can't have that whole area surrounded with fence, but that's the way they keep people out and wildlife in. And one of the things that's fascinating is the skill with which people have learned how to steal lumber. Now, in this bicycle, what you have is two people line up and they put a log inside the hole of a bicycle. And they take huge logs out this way. They have found so many of these bicycles over time that that's just a stack of illegal harvesting mechanisms, plus these guys. So sometimes they're brazen, and they'll take out a whole load of timber on these, and this is all confiscated harvesting, not the actual cutting, but the way of getting it out. So you get a little sense. There has to be, the incentive has to be big, and it is, and it's used. When you look right around the park, there is some substantial human pressure, and so sometimes you can see that the park does make a difference, even though it isn't making as much a difference as they want to claim. Okay, so now let's move to Chitwan. This is for those of you familiar with the region, Chitwan is almost at the same level at sea level, flat just north of India. There is the Royal National Park, and we have buffer zone forests located immediately adjoining, and the community forests that have been recently established. Both types of forests are characterized by some kinds of regrowth. And this is a pretty complicated one, and given timing, I'm not going to spend as much time on it. But this is the Royal National Park here and the Rapti River. These are the buffer zone that have had huge amounts of external NGO funding. And so in order to get these regrowth, these are community, but heavily financed from the outside, and very substantial regrowth. In this area, there's a lot of clearing, and some of these are community forests that were created recently. This is a region where there was not a lot of indigenous forest organization. Some are okay, some clearing. So what we're showing is a lot of different patterns. If we then kind of summarize the findings from the air, we find, sometimes people call social science on the one hand versus the other. This happens to be, on the one hand, some government forests are better managed, while others are degrading. Some community forests are better managed, while others are degrading. Neither management approach is a panacea. Regular monitoring appears to be a significant, and backing up some of this is looking on the ground, we'll talk a little bit more about it, factor influencing, in the one case, the heavily endowed national park monitors, and they spend a lot of money on it, and we're finding community forests where they monitor make a difference. So now, let's get down on the ground. And here we're going to be talking about the International Forestry Resources and Institutions Research Program. We have collaborative centers all over the world. It was initiated by the FAO in 1992, where they said, gee, get a database where we can figure out what's going on the ground. And we developed and use a common set of research protocols where we actually go in and do a random sample of forest plots and go and hug the tree. And while we're hugging it, we have a measuring tape we put around it and identify it, and then talk with the people and try to be sure that we've understood what's happening. So we then are trying to understand, is formal designation as a park, formal designation, associated with higher vegetation density than in non-parks? And that's a very tough question to ask across using the hugging data, because the DBH in a arid zone is quite different than the DBH in a more humid zone. So each of the foresters or biologists who leads our teams evaluates the entire forest after having done 30 to 50 plots. So they've done all the plots, and then we ask them to ask their evaluation, and they're asked to evaluate the vegetation density. And this is a comparison of 163 parks and non-parks across the whole world in those countries where we're doing studies. It's not every country by any manner means. And the foresters asked, is the vegetation density somewhat sparse, very sparse, somewhat, about average, somewhat abundant, very abundant? And officially designated parks, there are 76 in our sample. And the average distribution for that is the same as non-parks. Well, in non-parks, some of those are private, some of them are communal, some of them are government, but they're not parks. They're government forests for harvest. This is a huge array of different things that are not parks. Well, I'd like a graduate student that can tell me the difference between them. Yeah, there's no significant difference between these two. None. So if formal park designation does not make a difference, what does? John Williams and Clark Gibson, oh, I'm sorry, Gibson is, that should be Gibson, Williams, and Ostrom. We did a study and published in World Bank, and it is Gibson first author. My goodness. Cross-sectional study of 178 forest user groups, and we asked each of the groups, did they do any regular monitoring or yearly or occasional? And there is a very strong statistical relationship between regular monitoring of some sort and condition of the forest. So now we have some very exciting work that we're beginning to get to what we consider the gold mine that we hope to get even bigger and bigger. We now have 42 sites where we've been a second time. And when we've gone back a second time and hugged and measured trees and gotten species diversity, et cetera, now within time series, this is panel data. Now we can use the forest measuration data because we're not comparing across ecological zones, we're doing across time in the same forest. And as you can see, it's not a random sample in the whole world, but we do have 5 countries and a fair amount of hard work in the field. Now, here you can do 2 kinds of measures. One, we can look at basal area, diameter, breast height, and number of stems. And we can look at, using a t-test, what kind of, some of the government forests have lower basal area, some same type or better. So are we looking at only 22? But we found only 5% of them were better. Only 9% were better in terms of DBH. Community forests are doing a little bit better, at this aggregate measure. But we went on to, oh dear. We are missing a slide. Sorry. There's a slide missing. No, here it is, sorry. A little bit of disorder here. We went on to do a very careful further analysis where we looked at the change in DBH for a much larger individual set because we get down to the plots. And we looked at ownership types, the three that we defined earlier. And we found that ownership types did not have a significant change in DBH in our normal way of defining it. But look at this. In terms of change in basal area, meaning the DBH times the area, a very significant at the 0.01 level. And change in stem count, again, very significant at the 0.05. And so we're finding that the involvement of the user group in monitoring is making more different than the formal designation. Now, we have a number of studies in other IFRI that have been looked at, and I won't go into detail but if you're interested, we can give you the citations. I'm getting a little... So now we have a puzzle. How come user monitoring comes out to be so important repeatedly? This is a voluntary effort to produce a public good. There are people who have all sorts of ways to spend their time and get food for the household and money for income and their children's education, etc. And they're out monitoring, and they're doing this voluntarily. The game theoretic predictions would say that no one will voluntarily contribute to provide a public good. And this is particularly a second level because they've created the rules in many instances, and now they're monitoring them. So our earlier findings from farmer irrigation systems led, because we were out in the field, we came back to look at all of this in the lab. So let me now go to in the lab. There we use, for some of you, the Gordon-Schaefer curve that is a quadratic production function. We won't go into the details, but it is a very, in economics, it's a very common way of getting the math of a commons. And if we create such a game in the lab, where people are given payoff tables that are of this kind, they can't communicate, they overharvest. So the prediction of theory is substantial overharvesting, and they do it. So for that environment, the hardened theory is correct. Now, we add one capacity, that you may talk with one another, you may not threaten, you may not promise side payments after you get out the door, you can just talk, and you talk about anything. And we sat right there. In fact, I sat right there and put a tape recorder right in front of them, but I kept it so that I couldn't identify who was making what decisions at that point. And this is called cheap talk. And the reason that it's called cheap talk in game theory is that no one's enforcing whatever they say is cheap. So I promise Arini, I'll get the next draft to you tomorrow morning. And there's no one coming and waking me up at 4 o'clock in the morning and saying, have you gotten the next draft of the paper to Arini or not? My conscience does it, but no one external. So, but subjects make quite a good use of the opportunity to engage in cheap talk, and they use it first to agree on a harvesting strategy and verbal sanctions. So let's take a look at what that looks like. We, in our baseline experiment with no communication, where we did 3 experiments, the nice thing about an experiment is you know the yield. So you can look at how good did they do. Well, they got up to 21% of maximum, but that's not too good. And that was after, on the first few rounds, sometimes they went way below. They got back up to 21%. We introduced one-shot communication. That's the only thing that happens. And they get themselves up to 55% of maximum, a very substantial increase. Now, they still defect. So we did measure what they agreed upon, and we could tell whether or not they were 100%. And just open communication, there's still a high defection rate, but they're still getting a lot of improvement. This is significantly more. That was just one shot. Then we let them have repeated communication. Well, now look at the difference between one shot and repeated. And what is the difference? Well, part of it is after they come back and they've seen they never know exactly the distribution. The new ASU experiments will, but in our original one, they knew the total. And they'd come back in and somebody would say, some scumbucket over-invested. Because if we'd all done what we agreed on, it would have been 25 tokens in, and we're at 30. And there's some scumbucket in this room who did more than their 25. And I hope that scumbucket tomorrow morning just really feels terrible, because that scumbucket is earning just a few little cents more than we. And the scumbucket has hurt the rest of us. Cheap job. So in repeated, look at the difference. And that's verbal sanctioning. Okay. Then what we did was, again, I was seeing out in the field, because I've done a lot of the field research, that farmers would be sanctioning one another in a variety of ingenious ways, voluntarily, not because the state was sending police. They were creating their own rules. And so I came back to Roy Gardner, a very good game theorist, and said, Roy, how do we do a very rigorous game theoretic analysis of sanctioning, which we did in the late 80s. And then Jimmy Walker, who is a wonderful game theorist, helped get it into the lab. And we observed whether people would sanction, because the prediction is from game theory that they wouldn't. And that's what our game theory prediction was, they won't. So we call it an imposed sanctioning mechanism, because it was our design. And you could impose, you could pay 5 cents and zap somebody else 10, or then we increased it. You could pay 20 and zap somebody 40. We did a number of them. We did 8 experiments, and it does improve 21 to 37. So there is an improvement. But the average net yield, when you subtracted all the fines and fees, was only 9%. So the imposed sanctioning was used, in fact, it was overused. That was our finding. And that was published back in the early 90s, and it was kind of, people didn't believe that they did it, and then they were very surprised they overdid it. Now that's been replicated by FAIR and a variety of other folks around the world, and they found very similar findings to ours that were published in '92. Then we allowed them to we took this and we allowed them to have one-shot communication and talk about it. And we imposed the sanctioning and had one sanctioning mechanism is what we created, not the sanctions. They then got up to 85% of maximum, best yet, but not when you took the cost of fees and fines out, but still improvement. Then we thought, well, Vincent talks about constitutional choice all the time. Let's have a constitutional convention in the lab. And so we brought people who had been through these sanctions, so they knew what it was. We brought them back to the lab and said, now you have a choice. We're going to give you an opportunity to communicate. You can choose what kind of sanctioning mechanism that you would like, if you want one, or you don't have to. We use simple majority vote. but we allowed them to craft their own rules. Well, 4 out of the 6 groups that did this crafted them and got up to 93%. And when you subtracted their fines and fees, they only went down to 90. They only had an infraction rate of 4%. Just an amazingly high conformance. 2 of the groups said, oh, we don't need sanctions, we're too good, we're going to agree, aren't we? And right away after they got started, they did very well, and then somebody would cheat, and then somebody else cheated, and they did better than here, but not much better than that. And then when you get when you look at the defection rate, you see why this isn't very much better than that. Anyway, this is a long story. These are years of working in the lab, but it was an effort to try to get at what we were observing in the field and explain it. Okay. Now, what have we learned overall? Well, protecting forested land by an externally imposed institution is feasible if you have enough money and fences, but it's very costly. You have to really build the fences. You have to have the cops out there in their cars coming around. They have to be unpredictable so that people don't figure out when to harvest and then when to hide. It may be strongly resisted locally. It may deprive the people who've been stewards of the land of the fruits of their past investments. It may not protect. And on the other hand, it may be appropriate for large tracts of relatively isolated forests or to protect extremely valuable sites. 2 of the Indian forests shown in the Tikal National Park. And for those of you who have not seen the supplement to the Leeuw, Ostrom, and Stern article in Science, I would urge you to look at our remotely sensed analysis of Tikal and 3 other national forests in Guatemala. But Tikal is worth it. And they spend lots of money, but they also get a lot of money from tourists. So there are other means to protect forested land against over. So involvement of local users is also feasible, but it does take time. There's time invested in design and working it out, and you've got to craft the right institutions for the right ecology. So, and part of the problem we're finding is that if there were locally evolved institutions in the past and they were ignored, what happened in Nepal in some instances, they presumed they weren't there and they just came in with nationalized, then you may have a very hard time regaining trust. You can't just wipe things out and then go back and say, oh, sorry, fellas, will you do it again? Very hard. External financial incentives may reduce overharvesting, but they must be sustained over time, and monitoring is necessary. So the big lessons are: beware of assuming that changing formal tenure is a sufficient policy change to affect harvesting. Don't just assume paper parks are always going to work. We need to study the successes and failures to develop better theory. We need rigorous, tough theory and to craft better policies. We need multiple empirical methods, and we've shown you 3, but there are many more, because we're dealing with a full array of human institutions, and you need multiple ways of understanding it. So thank you very much for listening for this long, long presentation, and I'll take questions at this point.